But now the floor is yours, Ricardo. I think you want to also share a presentation.
Okay, thank you. So I start straight away into our worked example by highlighting from FuelEU Annex 1 methodology for calculation, and to in fact start by the top of the slide by pointing to the composition of the greenhouse gas intensity for the energy used by a ship as the sum of the well-to-tank emission calculations and tank-to-wake calculation multiplied by, in the case there is installed wind power, by the factor of reduction that the FuelEU will give for the specific wind-assisted propulsion installation. When we look to the formulations, we can see that all fuel consumption will be included in the well-to-tank multiplied by the well-to-tank emission factors, and also the electricity-related emissions from shore power, which are given a factor of 0 as a policy measure to incentivize the use of shore power. We all know well-to-tank emissions from shore power are not 0, but this is a way or a measure already as from 2025 to incentivize shore power connections in EU ports. We see in the denominator the all mass of fuel used included, multiplied by a reward factor if you use RFNBOs, which will, multiplied here by 2, will reduce, in fact, the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel used in the specific calculation. And here, also included in the denominator, the energy provided by shore power, which was given an emission factor of 0 in the upper part of the equation. As far as the tank-to-wake part is concerned, we have a formulation that takes into account the mass of fuel and the specific tank-to-wake emission factors associated to the energy converters. And here, the calculations include not only the combustion emission factors, but also the tank-to-wake slippage emissions and emission factors associated to specific energy converters. So we say, in general, the units provided in the result illustrate the concept of the FuelEU with grams of CO2 equivalent over megajoule, which is in fact all the fuel converted into well-to-wake CO2 equivalent units over the total energy used on board the ship over the compliance year. And this is the concept of the greenhouse gas intensity, different from the concept of compliance balance. For the compliance balance, we have a calculation which is based on the difference between the target and the actual intensity of the ship multiplied by its total energy. I mentioned the wind-assisted propulsion just to illustrate the factors that are associated to different ratios of installed wind power over installed propulsion power. So depending on the ratios, you can get a reward of 0.99 to 0.95, depending on the installed power. And this will, as I will show in my example, bring an additional benefit in the compliance strategies that you may apply. You see the concept for wind-assisted propulsion in the FuelEU based on wind installed power. In the future, we have the commitment to pursue a possibility to integrate wind energy as part of the greenhouse gas intensity calculation methodology, which now we don't have in view of an absence of a methodology for a verifiable and traceable method to compute energy from wind. So we already mentioned the reference value. We start by highlighting the importance of the reference value in the context of the regulation. It provides the starting point for assessment of the performance in terms of greenhouse gas intensity of different ships. In the table, you see here the different targets translated into grams of CO2 per megajoule concrete values, so from 2025 to 2050. And you see in red in the table the different associated greenhouse gas intensities if you would change 100% of your energy on board the ship through a different specific fuel and energy converter technology. So we see from very low sulfur fuel oil and marine gas oil, the 91.6 and 19.6 associated values, but then you see how it would change if using, for instance, an LNG in a medium speed engine. The change wouldn't be so dramatic in view of the methane slip associated to this energy conversion technology. And then you see that only using methanol, ammonia, or hydrogen wouldn't really necessarily drive you in the right course for compliance, especially if you use fossil-based versions of these fuels. And this is the practical effect of a well-to-wake calculation framework. As I mentioned, the reference values based on the fuel mix reported in MRV in 2020, where we ran FuelEU calculations for greenhouse gas intensity. In practice, and as a very basic statement, existing installations with very low sulfur fuel oil, marine gas oil, or LNG in medium speed engines would not lead to compliance in 2025. Unless you blend in or you introduce low greenhouse gas compatible fuels in the mix. Also, fossil-based methanol and ammonia would, as I demonstrated, not be eligible for a compliant route with the FuelEU. Of course, in the IMO context, it's always important to mention that you can still build the LNG methanol power vessels, obtain a good EEDI, and have some benefit in CII and still not be compliant with FuelEU if you don't use renewable and low carbon sustainable fuels. We see here in the context of the technologies and energy conversion that would lead you towards compliance. We see the LNG, slow speed, auto and diesel cycle engines would lead to a route of compliance, LPG and ethane based energy systems also. So indeed, amongst fossil fuels, you can still find compliance routes for LNG and LPG in slow-speed engines, which are in fact compliant to 2034 or even 2039 if you use banking of surplus already as from 2025. So these would be still fossil-based technologies which would still be eligible for compliance strategies under FuelEU. Other main options would be biofuels, RFNBOs, shore power and wind, as I've shown. In the specific case of biofuels, we refer to RED for the certification of the fuels, and this can take into account eligibility of biofuels from 50 to 65%, depending on the year of the installation producing the fuel. So in fact, the well-to-tank intensity can be between 32.9 and 47 to be considered under FuelEU. If not met, the biofuel is given the same value as for fossil fuels. Biofuels used for CII also will need to meet this RED certification thresholds. As opposed to ETS, where we have biofuels RED certified 0 rated, the FuelEU will consider de facto the exact well-to-tank emission factor. So there is this important difference between FuelEU and ETS. And in ETS, in fact, biofuels are, if RED certified, assigned as 0 CO2 emissions. As far as RFNBOs are concerned, or even low carbon synthetic fuels and on OPS, this slide highlights the 70% saving threshold in terms of greenhouse gas intensity, which stems from the RED certification framework. In FuelEU, as Peter already presented in his initial slides, the energy from RFNBOs until the end of 2033 will count twice. So this means halving the greenhouse gas intensity that you calculate when using such fuels. In DCS and CII, since these are also still tank-to-wake frameworks, e-methanol will have no benefit over fossil methanol. However, biomethanol will already in CII be considered more beneficial given the developed guidelines for biofuels under CII. The status of ammonia and H2 and hydrogen for CII is currently also not clear. In terms of RED certified RFNBOs, just like with RED certified biofuels, ETS rates them as 0. Again, here is different in the context of FuelEU. We give the exact well-to-tank value to these fuels. So they will be merited as a function of their potential in greenhouse gas intensity reduction. I make a note on low carbon synthetic fuels. These are fuels such as blue methanol or other low carbon liquid fuels or gaseous fuels produced from low carbon hydrogen. The methodology for calculation of the savings from these fuels is still under development under the recast exercise of the gas directive. So here we need to wait for December 2024, where a delegated act for calculation of the greenhouse gas intensity of these low carbon synthetic fuels will be issued, but these will also be eligible for compliance with FuelEU. I mentioned already in terms of OPS, the zero greenhouse gas intensity in terms of well-to-wake. This may change in the future as we may incorporate this value in the future in the FuelEU revision. So I'm giving you the assumptions for the worked example that I will now start and highlight the very detailed or more detailed assumptions for this worked example. We look at a container ship operating intra-EU. So 100% of its used energy will be under scope of the FuelEU. So it's a super modern container ship, has all the energy efficiency technologies. Bear in mind, however, this will not help directly with FuelEU compliance. So FuelEU compliance, we look at greenhouse gas intensity of the energy used. So the consumption in terms of very low sulfur fuel oil and marine gas oil, we calculate the energy derived under scope from the fuel consumption reported and compute the CO2 equivalent emissions. The greenhouse gas intensity can be calculated, so we can determine non-compliance with FuelEU in 2025, which we require, where we require 89.3 grams of CO2 per megajoule. So the compliance balance can be calculated. It will be negative. A penalty is calculated in the order of above 700,000 euros for this specific case. If the ship doubled the fuel consumption, the greenhouse gas intensity would be still the same as you see here. However, more fuel consumption, more compliance balance would be affected, and the penalty would be doubled. So bear in mind this relation in the formulas in terms of the fuel consumption, energy, and effect on the compliance balance. If the ship only did extra EU voyages, then only 50% of the energy would be in scope. Compliance balance and penalty would be reduced by half. We continue with the same ship, so now we look for ways of reducing the greenhouse gas intensity and trying to bring the ship into compliance by using different strategies in terms of energy. Let's look at OPS. For this specific ship, let's assume it plugs in for 10 port calls and 2 days per port call, with an average load of 2,000 kilowatts in terms of power demand at berth, and from where we can calculate the energy used and the reduction in terms of associated marine gas oil consumption as well. So we have shore power energy that is used, reduction in the consumption of the marine gas oil in auxiliary engines, and we can calculate, in fact, a greenhouse gas intensity reduction. However, for the specific assumption of 10 port calls and 2 days per port call in 1 year, the reduction in the greenhouse gas intensity is not enough and still not compliant with the requirements. However, it improves a lot the compliance balance, and now the penalty was already reduced by using shore power. If your assumption in terms of port calls, in terms of power demand at burst changes, maybe, and we've seen some cases where we have calculated the possibility of compliance only by using OPS in the case of a ship that otherwise uses no other renewable and low carbon fuel or other compliance technology. So this is the benefit already from 2025. To connect to shore power and gain some advantage in terms of the intensity calculations. Let's say the ship now does not connect to OPS in a port call after 2030. So now we're already talking about the scope for application of the OPS requirements. If the ship does not connect, there will be a penalty to calculate, stemming from non-compliant port call determined under FuelEU Article 6. For this calculation, for the penalty, we will base ourselves in the established total electrical power demand at berth, which is either the load balance demonstrated and approved by class or administration, or 25% of the total MCR of the main engines. Bear in mind that the load balance is typically the lower of the two. So it's worthwhile checking if you have one available for your ship, as you will be able to get, in case of a penalty is determined, to have a lesser amount calculated. 25% may be quite exaggerated for your specific ship type. In the case of a container ship, for instance, it can be quite exaggerated. The load balance is likely to be higher than actual demand. So assuming the load balance of 3,200 kilowatts, the penalty is calculated to an amount of more than 230,000 euros, based on the penalty calculation in the regulation. So before 2030, from 2025 to 2030, OPS is an opportunity. Think about it. From 2030 onwards, it's an obligation for this specific example that I have in the presentation. Let's say now you use OPS and wind-assisted propulsion. You decide to install an innovative kite, which gives you a factor of installed wind power over installed propulsion power of 0.12. Let's say a bit more than 10% of the installed power in terms of wind power. The multiplier you can use is determined in the regulation, and now you can bring your ship to a compliance framework. In fact, already with a compliance balance of 601 tons of CO2 equivalent and no penalty determined. Now, the case for use of biofuels, in this case waste cooking oil with a very low well-to-wake intensity of 16.2 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. Waste cooking oil has indeed very low emission factor on well-to-tank. We replace marine gas oil by an equivalent energy amount of biodiesel. Bear in mind the different amount in terms of mass relates to the different densities of the fuels. We keep the 12,000 tons of very low sulfur fuel oil. So here we only change the fuel used in the auxiliary engine installation. And we can bring the compliance of the ship to below the requirements, and here obtain a positive compliance balance of just above 110 tons of CO2 equivalent and no penalty determined. So only by arranging different, arranging some blending of biodiesel into the auxiliary engine installation. In the case of RFNBO, and here I have a tweak in the slide. Let me just change something very quickly. And back. Okay. So, can you see my slides still? No? Okay, I'm going to put them back. Putting them back. Voila. Now they should be. Super, thank you. Editing and formatting at late hours of the night is usually not a good solution. So let's say we use now RFNBOs and use an e-diesel drop-in fuel with the specific well-to-wake intensity. Just look here how different even an RFNBO can be different from biodiesel as a waste cooking oil. So even with a higher well-to-wake intensity, but in the case of an RFNBO, we can apply the multiplier of 2. So we'll see how this works out in terms of the numbers. We replace MGO by the exact amount of e-diesel. So here the same energy content. And we don't do anything about the main installation. So VLSFO keeps as the main engine for propulsion fuel. The calculated energy content is increased in view of the multiplier of 2, and this brings the greenhouse gas intensity down into compliance, in fact, compliant all the way to 2029. Positive compliance balance determined, no penalty is applied, and you see that in practice, half the amount of RFNBO is needed to comply when compared with waste cooking oil. So this, in terms of the calculations, in terms of cost, would be important to determine how likely it would be the adoption of RFNBOs in terms of blending in fuel already as from 2025. Now, extra EU example. So we have the example now of the same container ship, but revisiting the example where the ship operates in extra EU voyages. We use the biodiesel waste cooking oil with the already expressed well-to-wake intensity, but with the ship operating in extra EU voyages. So again, we replace MGO by the waste cooking oil, but only 50% of the energy is in the scope of the regulation. So we consider only 50% of the total energy used on board the ship. However, since the FuelEU is scoping the average total annual greenhouse gas intensity of the energy used on board, so we do the calculations on an annual total average and not on a voyage-based target, all the 100% of the biofuel used can be counted for the energy under the scope. So in the end of the day, saying that we do the calculations in the end of the year, we put on one side the energy that is in the scope, we put on the other side the fuel that is used on board the ship, and we can pick exactly the renewable and low carbon fuels used to meet the energy that is in the scope of the regulation. Using this approach, the greenhouse gas intensity is reduced significantly, and this leads to a dramatic increase of the compliance balance. But this is in effect the recognition that the ship was using renewable and low carbon fuels well beyond the scope of what is under the FuelEU regulation. So in fact, by using in the whole international leg renewable and low carbon fuels, you end up getting a credit in the FuelEU compliance, and this is in fact recognition that you were using throughout the whole international voyage. In the case, for instance, of a blend, which you will not change halfway through the international voyage just because you're breaking your 50-50 in the international context. So here we acknowledge that all renewable and low carbon fuel investment should be rewarded in the context of the international extra EU voyages. We look now to this summary. Let's say we ran through the base case, we used OPS, we then changed to OPS plus wind. We looked at biofuels, RFNBOs, and biofuels in the end on the extra EU voyage. I would call your attention to one thing. In all the cases, we haven't changed the very low sulfur fuel oil amount, so we kept the 12,000 tons of very low sulfur fuel oil, and we only changed the amounts of the distillate that is used for the auxiliary engines. We see in terms of the energy, only in the case of the last extra EU voyage case, we halved the energy. In two cases, we used OPS. One of them, we introduced some factoring of wind-assisted propulsion. So we can see here, in relation to the 2025 target of 89.3, we managed to get very close only with OPS. Bear in mind, some cases may actually be compliant only with OPS. And then with the other technologies, we managed to come under the target of 89.3 just by mixing in the distillate, which can be compatible in terms of blending in fuel strategies for compliance with FuelEU. The compliance balance, you will note here, in particular, significant compliance balance with the OPS and wind. This can give you a perspective of possible pooling with other ships and getting reward from your overachievement, bearing in mind that pooling will, in fact, take into account some financial compensation when you pool with other companies, subject to private agreement arrangements. And then also the compliance balance of the ships engaged in extra EU voyages. So rewarded by the fact that they used throughout their whole voyage renewable and low carbon fuel in the installation. The penalties calculated, you can see for the base case, quite significant, reduced in case you use OPS, and no penalty applicable, of course, in the cases where you became compliant. And finally, to go towards the end of the presentation, just to bring in the angle of the flexibility arrangements. If there is a compliance surplus, the company may bank the compliance balance for the following years. So in the case of the inter-EU biofuel, we have the compliance surplus of 110.5 tons of CO2 equivalent, may be banked for the following year. In case there is a compliance deficit, you can borrow also from the next reporting period. So in the case of the OPS case study, where we had here a compliance balance of minus 843 tons of CO2 equivalent, we could borrow, but however, the amount for compliance on the next year would be aggravated by 10%. So you would have to meet on the next year a significant compliance balance in this case. The amount to be borrowed is limited to 2% of the required greenhouse gas intensity times the energy. So you see here, the case of OPS, the maximum amount to be borrowed would be 944.8 tons of CO2 equivalent. Case of pooling is quite interesting. So the case of pooling, and before going into the exact example, the pooling will reward overachievers that achieve significant compliance balance for a specific reporting period. if the compliance balance is significant enough to provide for compliance of other ships, a company may, point 1, bring other ships of the fleet into compliance. Point 2, bring ships from other companies into compliance under specific private agreements with other companies, which would inevitably be associated with possible financial compensations between the different companies. And this can, in fact, lead to a business case for companies that decide to invest and overachieve in terms of technology in specific ships for compliance under FuelEU. In this example, an LNG carrier with a slow-speed diesel engine using 20,000 tons of LNG on extra EU voyages will be able to achieve a significantly low compliance, a significantly low greenhouse gas intensity with a significant compliance surplus. So you see here a significant 6,000 and close to 6,500 tons of compliance surplus, which will give enough surplus to bring 5 container ships which do nothing to comply other than paying to comply under a pooling arrangement, or if the same fleet that can be brought into the pooling within the same fleet. In this case, if one of the container ships was converted to run on methanol and only use methanol, and then you would have even a further higher compliance surplus that would help to bring in close to 40 similar container ships. So this is a mechanism that, on one hand, allows ships that have, let's say, that are currently through their midlife of operation that would have significant retrofit cost for compliance with FuelEU. They can comply under the flexibility of a pooling arrangement. And the potential for pooling may bring significant reward to the companies that decide to invest now already in disruptive technologies and renewable and low carbon fuels. So that was it. Open for questions.
Thank you very much for those work examples. I think it's very good to have to see them and see how you can actually improve.